Okay, you can, as I said on Sunday, whether you're in Matthew the ninth chapter or Mark the second chapter or Luke the fifth chapter, not important since all the accounts are basically the same, with the addition only that Luke puts one illustration or comparison in that the other two do not. But just as a means of following through, it doesn't make any difference which one you're in. We'll be probably referring at least um, back and forth pretty much. Remember, um, the main thing we talked about on Sunday was about the calling of Matthew and the implications of the fact that Jesus saw him as nobody else saw him, and that was that while others saw him as a scourge on their society and on their economics, uh, Jesus saw a man sitting in his booth, and that's what was important. And Jesus could see in Matthew something that he wanted to develop in him, I guess, the best way of putting it, and that is to be one of his apostles, one of his messengers, to take his place along with the other men that would be called to fill the void that would be in the ministry of Jesus when Jesus' time was no longer to be here on earth. It's also important that as we look at this Jesus' teaching on fasting, using fasting as a kind of a springboard to teach them about some things um, regarding their own attitudes, but also um, the first illustration that he's going to use, the that of the bridegroom. It's interesting that he was directed in such a way that he knew uh, he already knew, of course, what he was facing, and at whose hands he would be facing it. And it's interesting that he went about it in his subtle way, putting them in their place in terms of uh, criticizing Jesus, really his disciples, Jesus' disciples, for not fasting as they should, according at least to their standard and their what they had become their habit. So um, Matthew, as he was called, decided to have a dinner, fest feast, really at his house upon his calling, at which it's revealed that um, that Matthew's, I guess, associates, because it says that there were other sinners and publicans at the festivities that Jesus reclined at the table with, and of course, immediately the Pharisees would start finding fault with that. But they did it in such a way because they remembered what happened last time. They challenged Jesus directly. So they thought that if they did a around the curve way of getting to him, that they might be a little more successful. So the first thing they said was not to Jesus specifically or Jesus directly, but rather to his disciples. And really, their effort was actually very clear to Jesus, and was probably clear to most of his disciples, if not all of them. What they were trying to do was drive a wedge between Jesus and his disciples. And of course, Jesus' answer or response to them was such that um, he was going to give them a very important lesson on some of their cultural mores or their religious traditions that they had already uh, become accustomed to, that were, of course, not in conformance with Jesus's um, later to be new religion. So in Matthew the ninth chapter, verse 14, and Mark the second chapter, verse 18, and Luke 5:33, the disciples of John are on the scene. Now, whether they arrived there because they heard what was going on, or the Pharisees may have pulled them into the setting, um, if they came in on their own out of a matter of curiosity, um, it was probably done in such a way by them that perhaps they thought that if the Pharisees were successful with Jesus' disciples, that would somehow make their status or make their situation a little bit better. Because remember that they had been hearing about Jesus the same as everybody else had been in the area, so they knew what Jesus was doing, and they knew that the disciples that were following him, what kind of teachings that they were exposed to, and they'd been part of seeing these great signs and wonders that Jesus had been doing. But regardless of the way that they got there, they were on the scene. And it was probably because of their jealousy of Jesus' disciples that they posed this new challenge to Jesus. And they did it in such a way that makes it clear that the feast was already the feast was already going on, and it was at the same time that um, they should have been fasting, at least in those disciples' eyes. We talked very briefly, and we'll look at some other scriptures here in a minute. We talked very briefly about Old Testament fasting. All the scriptures that talk about different situations where fasting occurred, and we didn't really talk about the purpose, but we'll see that clearly tonight. What had happened, though, was, remember that in Old Testament times, when God gave the law to Israel through Moses, he only commanded one fasting time. Only one. That's the only one that was commanded. Okay? And that, of course, being on the Day of Atonement, for the Day of Atonement. However, what had taken place over the years is that the Israelites had come up with other reasons for fasting. And when we look at some of these Old Testament scriptures, we'll look at both the good and the bad of those. So as we come up into Jesus' time, this evolution of fasting that had occurred during the Old Testament times had gotten to the point where in Jesus' time there was a whole lot more fasting going on than needed to be going on, and a whole lot more than God or Jesus at this time, of course, would expect. But if this feast was taking place because of the wording in the Mark 2nd chapter, verse 18, says that they were fasting. Okay, well then that means that because in Jesus' time that they were feasting, they fasted either on a Monday or a Thursday. Okay? This feast would have been taking place on Monday or Thursday because they fasted twice a week. I'll get my tongue untied here in a minute. Okay, they fasted twice a week in Jesus' time. So this feast that was taking place that the disciples found fault with would have been on either a Monday or a Thursday, because of the wording in Mark 2:18 says that they were fasting. So whether the Pharisees made this challenge, or the disciples made this challenge, really becomes almost a moot point. The point is that this was a tactic designed to displace or to drive a wedge between Jesus and his disciples, as well as, I guess, to elevate either the scribes and the Pharisees, or to elevate the position of John's disciples, okay, John the Baptizer. Okay? All right. So what about this? What about this point about them fasting um, on 2 days of the week? Well, Leviticus the 16th chapter and the 23rd chapter talk about this one time command that God commanded a fast take place, and that would be for the Day of Atonement, and it was to be observed on a specific time of the year, just like every other spiritual. I'm not going to use the term holiday because that's a perverted word nowadays, but just like every other spiritual day of dedication. Okay, God made a specific time, and that was to take place, of course, the 10th day of the 7th month. Now, in some Old Testament scriptures, it's not always called fasting, but the words that are used give us a clue as to what the purpose of fasting was. Okay? In Psalm, the 69th chapter, verse 10, the psalmist there refers to afflicting or chastening my soul with fasting. Okay? Now, in New Testament scripture, Acts the 27th chapter, verse 9, there the term fast is definitely referring to the Day of Atonement fast. Okay? But what does this term afflict one's soul that usually refers to fasting, what does it actually mean? Well, it suggests, of course, the purpose for fasting. It was to have an effect on the soul, not the body, not the body per se, but rather an effect on the soul. And of course, the purpose or the real reasoning for that we'll talk about in just a minute. But there were many feasts in many fasts in the Old Testament. Take the E out, Wayne. Many fasts in the Old Testament. It had gotten to the point where many, when any unusual event, as well as some scheduled events, occurred, there was a fasting that took place. For instance, in the threat of war. Okay, in the threat of war, or the threat of it, either in war or the threat of war. For instance, Mizpah in the Philistine war, and First Samuel, the 7th chapter, verse 6. It says that they fasted in preparation when loved ones were sick. David fasted when? When his son was ill, even when he was ill. Okay. And of course, when someone died, okay, the men of Jabesh Gilead fasted 7 days for whom? Upon the death of whom? First Samuel, 31st chapter. First Chronicles, the 10th chapter. Upon the death of Saul. Okay, and of course, David and the people fasted for not just Saul, but also for Jonathan. Okay. So when someone was ill or when someone died. Now, they also, of course, fasted when they sought God's forgiveness. Okay? When Moses beseeched God uh, upon for the sins of the Israelites, how many days did he fast? Do you remember? Fasted 40 days. Okay? Fasted 40 days on behalf of the sins of Israel. Deuteronomy, the 9th chapter. Okay? Nineveh, of course, fasted also at the preaching of Jonah, as well as Daniel as he confessed the sins of Israel in Daniel, the 9th chapter. Okay? They also fasted when they were facing impending danger. Jehoshaphat fasted when he was threatened by Edom. Okay? Second Chronicles, the 20th chapter. Nehemiah, when he heard about the state of Jerusalem. Okay? In Nehemiah, the 1st chapter. They set up fast to commemorate certain calamities. Okay, the burning of the temple, Jeremiah the 52nd chapter, on the 10th day, the 10th day of the 10th month. Okay, remember, was the besieging of Jerusalem, and then on the 9th day of the 4th month was its fall, and of course a fasting took place. Really, there'll be a fasting of mourning, okay, of lamentation in 2 Kings, the 25th chapter, verses 3 and 4. Okay? So fasting was set up purposely to commemorate an event, but it could also be on the part of being a natural reaction to some form of grief. Okay. Now, here's what's the important point to make about the fasting that occurred in Old Testament, especially, but throughout the Bible. The purpose of this afflicting one's soul, see? The purpose of afflicting one's soul or chastening one's soul was to humble the soul, okay? It was not necessarily to have any effect, as some have promoted. It was not to have any particular effect on the body. So you didn't do it because of the condition of the body. You did it to, most often, to prepare your soul for a particular dedication time, okay? And usually it was directed toward God, okay? So while there were many reasons for fasting, fasting was primarily intended by God. If you look at the reason for commemorating the Day of Atonement, it was specifically designed to humble the soul, to bring one's soul down to a sense of humility for who God is, but more importantly, what God has done for them. Okay? And that's what the primary purpose of it. Now, in modern, and as time went through, and even in more modern times, okay, there's about 4 different ways that people fast nowadays. Okay, there's either the original intent, which was, by the way, the original fasting designed by God was no food of any kind for 40 days and nights. You were allowed to have water, and that's because God knew you need to have water to stay alive. So again, it wasn't to tear down the body, it was to humble the soul. Okay? There's in Daniel, the 10th chapter, there's a discussion there about a partial fasting, which is just simply a restriction of diet. Okay, and then let me now the length of the fast could be anywhere from 1 day and 1 night, all the way up to several days, several nights, even over a month. Okay, now let me ask you, what is the see if you know? I'm sure you sharp ones will. What's the longest fast recorded in the Bible? The longest fast recorded in the Bible. Jesus was 40. What's that? You think it was 40? Moses was 40. We just talked about that, okay? How about Elijah? His was 40 also. Okay? So the longest fast recorded in the Bible is 40 days and 40 nights. Now, we're not going to get into them now. There's anatomical and biological reasons for that, which we won't go into. But the point being is that Jesus, in New Testament times, provided the example to us of what an actual fast should be, and that is for 40 days and 40 nights. If you're going to do an absolute, truthful fast, that's the duration that was set sort of as a precedent in both Old Testament and New Testament times. But what had happened over the years was that people started using it as a way to, oh, look at me, I'm holier than thou, okay? Or, as we used to call them in the Marine Corps, dog and pony shows, okay? Oh, look at me, I'm fasting. Look what I'm doing, okay? Uh, what God said in Isaiah the 58th chapter was that I would, instead of making these external displays of bowing one's head and head like a bulrush, like a bulrush, and spreading sackcloth and ashes. Does anybody know what a bulrush is? We have them today. We call them something else. Anybody ever heard of a cattail? That's what a bulrush is. Okay, that's what it most appears. What he said was, I would rather have you loose the bonds of wickedness. I would rather have you the oppressed go free. I would rather you shared your bread with the hungry. Bring the poor into your house. That's what I'd rather have you do than fast. So even because they weren't fasting at the time when God said you should fast, they were doing it for their own purpose. Okay? And when in Isaiah, the prophet talks about the people complaining because they didn't think God was listening to them through their fasting and prayer. And the reason, the reason for it was because they were not doing it with a attitude of penitence. They weren't doing it as a means of repenting from their sins. Okay? They were simply doing it to say, well, we just check that off. Okay. The same point was made about the ceremonial feast that Zechariah talked about. Okay, that they came up with all these ceremonial fasts that they did. Okay, and so the Lord responded to them in Zechariah. It's in the 7th chapter. He said, the reason that you don't feel blessed is because you haven't done it for me. You've done it for yourselves. Okay? So clearly what God expected was, of course, that the fasting be done directed toward him and with a purpose or with a goal of humbling one's soul to continue to recognize who God was and what he has done for us. Okay? Now, did Jesus ever teach on fasting? Well, that's the rhetorical question if we've been paying attention to our lessons. Okay? Matthew, the 6th chapter. Let's turn to Matthew, the 6th chapter, verses 16 through 18. Whenever you fast, do not put on a gloomy face as the hypocrites do, for they neglect their appearance so that they will be noticed by men when they are fasting. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. But you, when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that your fasting will not be noticed by men, but by your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Now, the first thing to notice is that Jesus said, not if you fast, but when you fast. So there's an implication there that, as Jesus was confronted here, is that this fasting, his disciples, there would come a time when they would fast. Okay? But then that led him right into telling them, or getting in their case, so to speak, about when fasting should take place. Okay? And it's related to his illustration regarding the bridegroom. Okay? In the 15th verse, the very next verse of Matthew, the 19th verse of Mark, the 2nd chapter, and Luke, the 5:33, okay? Jesus used the illustration that you don't fast when the bridegroom is here. That's a time to have a feast, basically, okay? And think back to the reason for having a big feast before the wedding takes place. The whole purpose is to be festive, right? The bridegroom is still there. But then when he said, when the bridegroom leaves, that's the time for fasting. Now, what's that an allusion to? What is that an allusion to? The bridegroom is here, we feast. The bridegroom's going to be gone, we fast. What's that an allusion to? Him. That's right, okay? And it's very important to recognize that Jesus was saying that because the very people that were challenging him were the people that were going to crucify him. Okay? And so he was definitely putting them in their place for even asking that question or making that challenge to him. Okay? Now, we don't have to guess about whether or not he was referring to himself because Scripture tells us that Christ is the bridegroom. Ephesians, the 5th chapter, verses 22 through 31, starts with the illustration of wives being subject to their husbands, just as the church, okay, just as Christ is the head over the church, all right? But the point being is that also in 2 Corinthians, 11th chapter, verse 2, the Apostle Paul said the church is Jesus's bride. That makes him the bridegroom. And so it's very easy to understand why Jesus was talking about himself in the future, obviously, when he used this particular illustration. Plus, in John the 3rd chapter, verse 29, what did John the Baptizer say when he was ready to turn over, so to speak, everything to Jesus' ministry? What did he say? He that has the bride is the bridegroom. Okay? Specifically identifying Christ as the bridegroom that was to come. Okay? So when his marriage, the spiritual marriage, obviously, that was going to take place, then at that time, the church would be married to Christ as the bridegroom. Okay? And again, he's saying this right before the very people that are going to crucify him, that are literally going to murder him. Because, make no mistake about it, that's what took place. He was guilty of no offense, had done nothing to anybody. In fact, had done everything to help everybody. Okay? And they just flat out murdered him. Okay? Because of their own personal prejudice, their own personal egos. Okay? Any questions on Jesus being the bridegroom in that illustration that he talked about regarding the time to feast is when the bridegroom's here, the time to fast is when he is no longer here. Okay, then there's a few other illustrations that we'll go through pretty quickly that kind of teach a little bit different, not an additional, I should say, an additional aspect of this same principle, and that is the kingdom, okay? The church, as it were, okay? The first illustration is that of taking a piece of new garment and sewing it onto the tear of an old garment, okay? And that is, the illustration there is because if you take that new, all you ladies, all of us, all you ladies and all of us that know that have ever had to do any repairs on our clothing know that if you take a new piece of cloth and you sew it onto old garment, the first time you wash it, what happens? That new cloth shrinks, and that makes the tear even worse than it was before. Okay? So the application, of course, in that situation is that Jesus did not come just to kind of mend Judaism with Christianity, but rather it was to put an entirely new and different religion altogether. Okay? Now, the new wine into old wineskins. Okay? You don't put new wine into old wineskins. Remember what the wineskins, remember, were made out of usually animal hide. Okay? And the first time you use them, you put new, fruit of the vine, grape juice or whatever into those, and you put the yeast in there to get them to ferment the first time. What happens to that container? Starts to expand, okay? Well, like a balloon, it can only expand so far, okay? Plus, carrying it around all this time in that hot sun or whatever, they get old, they get brittle, okay? So you don't take, if you take and you, plus when you pour it all, I mean, I've never used a wineskin, but I suppose it's the same. When you pour out the wine out of this old wineskin, you don't get all the dregs from the bottom of it, okay? Because that's the stuff that settles the bottom. So when you put new juice into that old wineskin, all those dregs ferment it all over again. Well, that hide can only stretch so far, okay, before it's going to start cracking or bursting, okay? So again, the application here is that Christ did not pour the new wine of his teaching into the old wineskins. Who would have been the old wineskins of Jesus' teaching at his time? No, okay, we're in Jesus' time. Let's put the old law to the side. In Jesus' time, when he's referring to the old wineskins of teaching, what disciples is he talking about? John's, right. That's exactly, because remember, they're in the presence, okay? They're in his presence, okay? So Jesus is not going to put his new wine, which is the new teaching, into the hearts or into to give it to John's disciples to disseminate, because he knew it would not be as effective, okay? He's going to put it into new wineskins, which will be whose disciples? His disciples, okay? So that's new wine into the new wineskins, of course, of the new disciples. It's interesting to note, at least I found this interesting when I was doing my study, that none of Jesus' disciples were ever John's disciples. That's why this principle can be made about new wine into new wineskins, because all of Jesus' disciples were his own. They never belonged to John, okay? And especially the 12 special disciples that he selected, okay? All right. Now, Luke adds one more illustration, and that is basically that a person who's used or who's accustomed to old wine will never accept the new wine. Why? That old wine is good enough for me. I'm not even going to try the new, okay? So the illustration here, of course, is that they will completely reject Christianity because they don't see any need to change. Now, who's he talking about there? The Pharisees and the scribes, of course. Okay, all right? Now, couple. I just want to spend one more minute because here's an attack that has come up over the years about the fact that there's variations in Matthew, Mark, and Luke's accounts of this as well as others, okay? And the bottom line on it is that their attacks hold no weight because they say that these variations are the result of just some made-up story. Well, they failed to recognize that Jesus his ministry took place over a period of about 3.5 to 4.5 years, okay? Let's just say about 50 months, all right? That over those 50 months, and how many different places did he go? Probably hundreds of places that he went. Telling or giving his teachings, it is very likely that he would have to adjust his teachings to fit the particular context that he was in at the time. It's sort of like we up here in Northern California, okay, believe me, are different than the Southern Californians, okay? I mean, we are. It's just that clear. So as Jesus would go from place to place, or he'd tell a particular teaching, whether it was about the sermon on, whether it was the Sermon on the Mount or another Sermon on the Mount, which remember we talked about when we talked about the Sermon on the Mount, that was given more than once. By most Bible scholars will agree, given more than once. Slight variations in the exact wording are going to take place. Okay? Those of us that were educators, we can do the same lesson year after year after year after year after year. Do we say it exactly the same? Do we? Of course not. Okay? So it has nothing to do with the fact that it does not destroy anybody's lack of credibility. And then the final point is, the question always comes up about Christians fasting today. And there's lots of opinions. There's lots of I don't know what they used to have a term for it, but Jesus taught when you fast, do it this way. He said when you fast. Okay, he didn't tell us exactly when we fasted. He didn't tell us for how many days, how long, whether it to be full, whether it to be partial. He didn't say, a lot of other things. He made it very simple. When you fast, that means if you want to fast, and remember, there is only an Old Testament command to fast, no New Testament command, because that old law was done away with. Remember that, okay? So, there is no commandment that you fast, okay? If you want to fast, fast. If you don't want to fast, don't fast. Remember the purpose of it. It's to prepare, it's to humble your soul. If you can have a better relationship with God by fasting, then by all means do it. But you cannot impose that upon anyone else. And another thing to remember, if you're telling somebody you're going to fast, you're doing it for the wrong reason. Okay, it's that simple. You're going to fast, fast. Okay, now, but there's absolutely no New Testament scripture that I'm aware of, and I don't think you can find it, that says you have to fast. Okay, didn't get to the question. What I will do is Is there anybody that did not come up with an answer for the thing on any of the questions? Okay. What I'll do is I will send this to Jennifer, and Jennifer can email it to everybody, okay? Just so you can see how I compare. Some of them, a bunch of the questions were about the lesson a couple of lessons ago about the demoniac, okay? So we didn't spend a lot of time on talking about that today. We didn't need to, okay? And there are some that are lists that are on certain pages in our book. But I'll pass this to Jennifer, and she can send it all out to everybody for what